it on before I can talk. Good afternoon. I suppose I've just been introduced as Hernando de Soto, which I am. I'm Peruvian, from far away. And I chair an organization, a think tank, an action tank, which discovered some 20, 30 years ago that we really didn't know as much as we thought we knew about the world. We think that we're about 7 billion people, and that in 1989, basically when communism collapsed, there was one game in town, and it was capitalism. But then thinking closely to our own reality, we became conscious that the majority of us weren't either here or there, that those who benefited of the system were a minority. It was a very good system. It was the one that had survived. But the majority were outside. And they were in transition, and we called them the extra-legals. Some people call them the informal economy, some people call them the shadow economy. We call them extra-legals. We thought that they were going to be a force to be reckoned with, and we started calculating how big this force was in Latin America, then gradually worldwide. In the case of Latin America, it served us well because we've empowered it. We found out that the first thing is that it has assets, but they're not entitled to them legally. And it's a problem, that they work, they're not unemployed. Anybody who's poor and unemployed dies of starvation. And we thought it was important not to die, and therefore to find out what it meant being within the law. So after a while, we got very interested in mapping. We got very interested in mapping because we sort of saw ourselves within that field. We said, most of these people who do mapping are trying to look at reality, but the reality that God has created, the environment. But there's another environment, which is the environment that man has created, which is this environment of globalization, of legal systems that talk to each other. And where all of a sudden we've done pretty well. Since the Second World War until today, the world has grown more than since Jesus Christ appeared in 2,000 years. So obviously the system works. But it's obviously not necessarily there for everybody else. And we also are, in a way, Wittgensteinists, which is that we follow the thinking of Wittgenstein, who said some very simple things like, if you have to look at the universe is made up of things in relationship to each other. Look at that tiny little sentence, things in relationship to each other. That means there's two things. There's the things themselves and how they relate to each other. And things that are relations, marriages, how I'm talking to you, are not things you can grab. The only way you can catch them is documenting it. That's what's got us closer to mapping. Then about 10, 11 years ago, at least 5 heads of state of the Middle East started calling us and said, you know, this thing that you're looking at in Latin America seems similar to something we're trying to see in the Middle East and North Africa. Can you come in and try and measure it? Because that's what we are bean counters. And we know that when you go in and measure something, you're always in for surprises. In my own country, we just recently had big problems in the Amazon, where all of a sudden the prices of raw materials are going up, lots of foreign investments, lots of indigenous people getting very angry at the foreign investment. And we were told that there were 1,500 tribes in the Amazon. By the time we finished counting after 1 year, we had found 5,000. We were then invited to Nigeria, the Niger Delta, where 30% of Nigeria's oil is found. And going in there, the first thing you get at the airport is, welcome to the Niger Delta, fountain of wealth of Nigeria. Population between 15 million and 30 million people. And so, as time goes by, we know that we know less. All of a sudden, the West is in a huge crisis, and the West supposedly has everything under record. Everything is recorded in the West, the automobiles, the airplanes, the boats. And now they've got a big crisis, and the big crisis is essentially because they don't know what they've got. They've created $700 trillion of financial derivatives, and they don't know where they are. And that's the reason that you have this confidence crisis. So what we do is count. And we feel that counting, but not necessarily the counting of God's creation, which is the environment of nature, but man's creation, which is how we've created havens for some and lack of havens for others, becomes important. Our work in the Middle East, which is part of what we do throughout the world, of course got interrupted like everybody else's with the Arab Spring. And that's what this infograph behind me is about. On the 17th of December of 2010, it's going to be a year now, in just about 4 days, Tariq Mohammed Bouazizi in the small town of Sidi Bouzid set himself on fire. Now, what was interesting, and the whole world watched, is that when he lit up, and people have set themselves on fire all over the world, from Vietnam to Latin America, all of a sudden people started walking the streets. And we, from faraway Peru, were looking at this. And people massively went to the streets, but not only that, we started counting how many other people had set themselves on fire in the Middle East. And you can see that it was about 35 in each Middle Eastern country. And all of them that were of the extra-legal sector, salesmen. So we said there must be a movement here. How can everybody with such different realities, Tahrir Square in Cairo is one thing, and of course Sidi Bouzid is another thing, and the Tuaregs of Libya are another thing. All of a sudden in this cultural diversity, one thing cuts across. So what's the commonality? So I've put people to work in these Middle Eastern countries to talk to the survivors and try and find out what goes on. The first thing we thought was there was a political agenda, but when we went to see in the 38,000 city of Sidi Bouzid in Tunisia, whether there was a political agenda, his mother said he didn't even look at the news. Il ne voyait même pas les informations. His sister said his goal was Ras el Mil. He wanted to accumulate capital. And when I asked his brother, and I reported to the Financial Times in an article I wrote about 3 weeks ago, I said, what would Muhammad say if he came down from the heavens to the earth? What would his death have accomplished? He said that the poor also have the right to buy and sell. Now, I've never heard anything so unromantic. This guy was obviously a businessman. But what is obvious, if there's one thing that Marx taught us, and I'm as far away from Marx as you can think, is that when a lot of people start suffering and saying they're suffering from the same way, is because there's a social class under formation. And so what I do with my team of Peruvians is we map underclasses, because they're the majority of the world. And so we also go into details. It's a big thing, suicide. What did they take away on the 17th of December to this businessman, 26 years old, who lights up right in front of the governorate? Well, they took a cart which had valuables, his scale, that was his capital, electronic scale, so he could weigh the fruits. That was $179. He had one crate of bananas. That was $9. He had another crate of apples. That was $22. All in all, he lost $225. Now, $225, I mean, you have to be poor, very poor, but to commit suicide over that, that is the visible side. The other side was that in Sidi Bouzid, which we went and mapped, the way we know how to map. What we mapped in Sidi Bouzid was where he lived. His father had squatted on ground, and he had received municipal recognition, but not a full title. So because he didn't have a full title, his property was undervalued. And then he was going to have trouble using that property to buy what was essential to get his food to the market, which was essentially an Isuzu truck. By the time the police had taken everything from him, 10:30 in the morning on the 17th of December, he no longer had the collateral to move ahead. But not only that, they had also taken away his right to stay in that place called the front of the governorate, where he was able to then have a place from which to show his wares. A businessman has got to be able to sell. And there are 9 types of extra-legal property in Sidi Bouzid, public and private buildings on land under dispute, properties legally transferred with scattered cases of joint ownership, properties in illegal subdivisions, properties in illegal subdivisions of state and private land, recent illegal subdivisions of farmland, houses built on old squatter settlements, invasion of lands after the revolution, formal properties illegally educated to Sidi Bouzid's industrial zone, and land reserved for private housing projects. He was right there where it says, shows in blue, and he was one of the 9 types of illegal settlers, which meant like 90% of people in Sidi Bouzid, he had no legal title and sense of belonging. And right below it, you see a blue zone, which is where he sold his stuff. There are legal procedures for becoming legal in both cases, but interestingly enough, none of them were really followed. For example, if you want to get and sell, you need une autorisation d'occupation du domaine public. If you want to really sell, you have to get a carte de commerçant détaillant. And if you really need to have a final legal title, you need from the Ministry of Interior certificate. And we said, well, obviously Mohammed wasn't a very legal guy, except that when we looked at the records, there was no one who had ever complied with all 3 systems. The law was there, but the law was not there for a poor capitalist. And that's what the third world is full of, poor little capitalists. So by the time his man had been slapped around, and at 11:30 he committed suicide, he had not only lost his wares, he had lost his wares which were given to him on credit, which he could not repay, so he couldn't get to the bank again. So he was bankrupt. And because he had no way of selling anymore in place, nor having his dreams of building a higher business, he was ruined. And when he lit up, obviously, all around the Middle East, somebody paid attention. I don't know why, because I'm not Middle Eastern. All I do is basically count. And I have counted in Tripoli the amount of illegals there are, and I also come up with 90%. And I did them in Cairo, and I also come up with 90%, roughly. And all those figures I get here. And if I try and find out how many of the businesses in all of these 3 countries, which I've studied to a certain degree with my people, we come up that about 80% of the businesses are outside the law. Now, what does that mean that they're outside the law? Who cares? It's very important. Because if you're outside the law, you cannot really hire anybody that's not a family member. So you're circumscribed. In my case of Peru, for example, it's a real problem. Because if I have to choose among the people who work with me, my brother-in-law, who really drinks too much, or the sister of my brother-in-law, who unfortunately just goes partying all the time, or if I have to look at somebody who got bad grades in school, it's not a good idea to just hire family members. You need to get out there, but for that you need a family. You need to have something more than a family. This is my alarm clock that I still don't know how to handle. Then you don't have limited liability. If an American comes and invests here, he's got limited liability. So does a Frenchman, so does an Englishman, which means he's only liable for a certain amount. That means they take minimum risks. They calculate them. It's a wonderful legal clause brought out by the Industrial Revolution. But in the case of Mohammed, there's no limited liability. He's totally unlimited liability. That's why he committed suicide. Because when one thing is taken away from him and he falls into political disfavor, he's completely out. So what's he done? Well, here you have a lot of documents. We call them extra-legal documents. Nowhere that we have actually been able to work in the Middle East and North Africa, and we haven't worked everywhere, have we ever found a house without a title, or have found a business that's undocumented. And we found the same things in the Bouazizi family, which means that there's a subsystem in each of these countries that does title. So if everybody comes to me and says, you know, you must understand, my friend, it's like us Peruvians. Arabs don't like documents. Not true. Arabs don't like buying and selling. Look at the Kasbah. I can't walk down Cairo without anybody trying to sell me everything down the street I go. So there is a substratum capitalist system, and Bouazizi seems to be part of it. And why doesn't he go and enter the legal system? So we go, And we found out that if you want to create a small business, it takes a long time. For example, if you're in Tantra, Egypt, it takes 544 days working 8 hours a day to have the right to open a bakery. That doesn't tell you the time it takes to actually, in Egypt, be able to keep the company going, what company, the business going, or even to exit it. In fact, most people don't stay in the system because it becomes so expensive. So what they do is they go to the extra-legal economy. If you go to the Egyptian jails, about 80% of them are in there for debt. And of all of those, 50% lose their houses. In the United States, when you go out and you get a mortgage and you have to lose your house, 1% of Americans lose their house, 2% of Norwegians lose their houses. But because of the lack of legal documentation, 50% of those in debt in Egypt, which I know a little bit better, lose their houses. What is it then that I'm trying to say with all of this? I'm trying to say that looking far away, and I really don't have much to do with the Arab world, a little bit, and you can see it through my features because every time I come to this part of the world, everybody says, you're a Lebanese. Obviously, the Moors came into Spain and left some traces, but I really don't know it. But I'd say that you have, like we in Latin America, an underclass that is eminently entrepreneurial, but it meets the hostility of a legal system. And this Arab Spring is a really interesting phenomenon because it means that somebody's thinking about renovation and you're rethinking your country. And when you rethink your country, there is a possibility to do something new. But one of the things that surprises me the most is when my Western friends, remember, I'm South American, deep in darkest Peru, when my Western friends meet about the Middle East and they get the group of 8 and say, we're going to support to make sure that the Middle East goes down the right road of open societies, of a good solid capitalist economy, nobody is talking about Mohammed Bouazizi. Nobody's talking about this powerful underclass. Because you see, one of the interesting things after interviewing the families of each of these people, and I'm going country by country because I find the phenomenon extraordinary, is that businessmen, especially poor businessmen, don't talk so well. They're very poor intellectuals. They do numbers. They have a different thing. The people who take the agendas are the guys who know how to spin, the guys who've got the tweeters, the guys who can operate on Facebook. But the guys that do the fuel are a different bunch. And it's important to identify them. You know, revolutions have gotten stolen before. And it's important to know what the obstacles are. If you're in Egypt, for example, and to find out what gets in the way, there's 347 groups of law that you have to deal with if you're poor, and you better know them. What are the chances that somebody who's poor be able to do that? If you have to deal with government office, you've got to do with 73 government offices. 73. I mean, I don't touch, whether I'm in the States or Europe, more than 4 or 5. So to undo a system that has blockages, you need an administrative system that puts you in contact with the people who are being affected. In the case of Tunisia, for example, we were told, well, you know, these informal businessmen are really a very small part of the lot. The big amount of them are the unemployed, les chômeurs. So go see the Association of Unemployed. So the first thing you find out about the statistics about unemployed is that if you work 2 hours a day, you're officially employed. Excuse me, 2 hours a month, you're officially employed. So those statistics are very rigged. We haven't seen one person who directs the unemployed that actually doesn't have a job. It's very simple. If you're a poor country and you're unemployed most of the time, you die. You die of starvation. So all those people they tell you're underemployed are not underemployed. They're working at something extra legally someplace else. And that means that it's important to get the statistics right and then find out how many people are involved. Why? Because wherever we walked in these different parts of the shanty towns of the third world, that's what we know how to do, the image of Bouazizi is emblazoned on walls and streets around the world. He's even commemorated on a postage stamp. And if you look at that postage stamp, he's even got a vendor's cart. I mean, how more commercial can you get? His story, however, is not simply a tale of one man. It's a story of the majority of ordinary Arab people eager to secure their place in the legal market. Our calculation, más o menos, vague, because we're Latin Americans, we're not precise, don't look at us as Swiss, is that Bouazizi represents about 180 million Arabs. And those were the people that it looks are on the streets. We'll find out. We'll finish our study in 1 year. And we think that it's important to focus because, you know, we did a revolution in Latin America in about the 1890s, and we turned from mercantilist, mostly dictatorial republics, into market economies, which have been growing at Chinese rates. And when a revolution happens, it's a wonderful opportunity to do the right thing. And I think it's time to look at the poor, because the poor, I think in this case, certainly the case of the Middle East, seem to have something interesting to say. Anyhow, we're getting into the mapping business, and we're trying to find out how not only to get God's work on the maps, but also the works of mankind, which sometimes do interesting things. Thank you.